Chapter 1. The Curse of Ashwick Manor. The morning had been uneventful, save for the insistent drumming of rain against the window panes of 221B Baker Street. I was seated by the hearth, perusing the latest medical journal, while Holmes, in one of his contemplative moods, stood by the window, watching the city beyond. It was then that Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a letter upon a silver tray. "This arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her tone laced with unspoken curiosity. Holmes took the envelope with a languid motion, but the moment his fingers touched the seal, a flicker of interest sharpened his gaze. "Ah," he murmured, "a matter of urgency, no doubt." He slit the envelope with a practiced flick of his penknife and withdrew a single sheet of parchment, its edges slightly crumpled, as though handled by unsteady fingers. As he read, his expression darkened. I leaned forward. "Something of interest, Holmes." Without answering, he handed me the letter. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged in places. "Mr. Holmes, you must come at once. The hour is drawing near, and I fear that fate shall not be kind. Every 50 years, death claims one of us, and now it is my turn. Lord Edwin Ashwick, Ashwick Manor." A chill crept over me as I set the letter down. This is a death sentence, Holmes." Holmes tapped his fingers against the mantelpiece. "It is a challenge, Watson, and one that requires immediate attention. Have Mrs. Hudson arrange our travel. We leave for Ashwick Manor within the hour." As our train rattled along the countryside, I found myself unable to shake the foreboding tone of Lord Ashwick's plea. Turning to Holmes, who sat in quiet contemplation, I decided to voice the question that lingered in my mind. "Holmes, have you ever encountered a case so deliberately bound to legend?" He exhaled through his nose, as though faintly amused. "Superstition, Watson, has ever been the veil under which men conceal their misdeeds. I suspect we shall find a very human hand behind this so-called curse." Nevertheless, the history of Ashwick Manor was not easily dismissed. I recounted what I knew. The first recorded death occurred in 1825. Victor Ashwick was found lifeless in his study, the doors locked from within. 50 years later, in 1875, another Ashwick met the same fate, again in a locked room, again without explanation. And now, in 1925, Lord Edwin fears that the pattern shall continue. Holmes tilted his head. "Curious, is it not, that only the dead remain silent, and the living whisper of ghosts? Tell me, Watson, who stands to gain from these deaths?" I frowned. "You believe this is murder, then?" His lips curled faintly. "A pattern, my dear Watson, suggests intent, and intent, in the hands of man, is never without purpose." The train whistle sounded. The mist-covered moors of Ashwick awaited. By the time we arrived at the station, dusk had begun its slow descent, casting elongated shadows upon the cobblestone platform. The air was thick with mist, curling in ghostly tendrils through the narrow streets. A waiting carriage bore the crest of the Ashwick family, and the driver, a wiry man with hollow cheeks, acknowledged our arrival with a silent nod. Holmes stepped in without hesitation, but as I followed, I could not ignore the unease that settled upon me. The landscape we passed was one of bleak rolling moors, where the skeletal remains of trees stood like mourners in the twilight. "You are unusually quiet, Watson," Holmes observed. I hesitated before answering. "It is this place, Holmes. There is something oppressive in the air, as though it does not welcome intruders." He regarded me with an unreadable expression. "Fear is the greatest architect of the supernatural, my friend. Let us hope that reason may yet dismantle its illusions." Ahead, Ashwick Manor loomed, a silhouette of decayed grandeur against the darkening sky. Its turrets and archways were draped in ivy, its windows darkened, like sightless eyes staring outward. The carriage came to a halt before the grand entrance. The doors creaked open. We had arrived. A butler, an older man with a stiff gait and hollowed features, ushered us inside. The entrance hall was vast, its walls adorned with oil paintings of long-dead Ashwicks, their gazes seeming to follow us as we passed. Lord Edwin Ashwick awaited us in the drawing-room, a gaunt figure whose hands trembled as he gestured for us to sit. "You came," he breathed, relief warring with dread in his eyes. Holmes took the seat nearest to him. "Tell me everything, Lord Ashwick." "Spare no detail," the Lord swallowed hard. "For centuries, my family has suffered under a terrible fate. Every 50 years one of us dies, always in the same manner, always in a locked room with no possible escape. My grandfather in 1875, his father before him, and now I fear I am next." Holmes studied him with sharp, calculating eyes. "What precisely do you fear, Lord Ashwick? A ghost, or something far more tangible?" Ashwick's lips parted, but before he could respond, a distant sound echoed through the manor, a low, shuddering moan, like the breath of the house itself. The butler's face drained of colour. "It has begun," he whispered. Holmes merely steepled his fingers. "Then we are precisely where we need to be, Watson." The fire crackled in the hearth of the drawing-room, yet it did little to dispel the damp chill that clung to the air. Lord Edwin Ashwick sat before us, his fingers laced together, his face gaunt with sleeplessness. Holmes observed him with an intensity that made the man shift uneasily. "You fear for your life, Lord Ashwick," he said. "But fear is an imprecise motivator. Tell me precisely what has led you to believe that your death is inevitable." Lord Edwin exhaled shakily. "It is the curse," he murmured. "Every 50 years it takes another of my bloodline. My grandfather in 1875, his father in 1825, each found dead in a locked room, no signs of forced entry, no trace of an assailant." Watson shifted uneasily in his chair. "And now, in 1925, you believe you are next?" Lord Edwin nodded. "Tonight marks the exact anniversary of my grandfather's death. If the pattern holds, I will not live to see morning." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "A locked-room murder is a magician's trick, my lord. There is always a mechanism. One merely needs to find it." His eyes flickered toward the dimly lit corridor beyond the drawing-room. "And I suspect we are about to be given a demonstration." The manor fell into silence as the hour drew near. Shadows stretched long and thin against the walls, the flickering candlelight casting ghostly movements across the corridors. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in, an unseen force settling over the house like a heavy shroud. The air itself seemed charged with something unspoken, as though the manor was holding its breath, waiting. Holmes stood by the grand staircase, arms crossed. He had not spoken for some time, merely observing. His gaze followed the faint creaks in the wooden floorboards, the slow shift of candle flames disturbed by unseen draughts. He was listening, not to the sounds themselves, but to the silences between them. Lord Edwin paced near the study, casting nervous glances at the great clock on the wall. 10 minutes until midnight," he whispered. Holmes did not reply. He was watching the study door, his expression unreadable. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and then a scream, not the wind, not imagination, a terrible, piercing cry torn from the depths of human horror. We ran. The cry echoed through the halls, chilling and raw. It came from the study. Holmes was first to reach the door, his movements swift and precise. His hand pressed against the wooden panels, locked. He rattled the handle, but it would not yield. From within, there was only silence. Lord Edwin, breathless, reached us. "Dear God, open it! Open it!" Holmes's gaze darted upward. "The transom window," he muttered, but it was shut, undisturbed. I turned to the butler. "The key. Where is the key?" The old man fumbled at his waistcoat pocket, his fingers trembling as he withdrew a brass key. Holmes snatched it, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The door groaned open. A body lay slumped over the desk, face down, utterly still. Richard Ashwick, Lord Edwin's cousin. His lifeless hands rested on an open book, a deep purple bruise wrapped around his throat, the unmistakable mark of strangulation. And yet, there was no one else in the room, no sign of forced entry, no way in or out. The study was untouched, not a book displaced, not a single thread out of place. And yet, Richard Ashwick was dead. I rushed forward, pressing my fingers to his wrist. "No pulse," I murmured. "He's been dead mere minutes." Holmes was already moving, his sharp gaze flickering over the study. He tested the window latches, bolted. The chimney, too narrow for any man. He ran his fingers along the wooden floorboards, the walls, searching for imperfections. Lord Edwin's voice was strangled. "The door was locked. You saw it yourselves. How could anyone have—" Holmes raised a hand for silence. He moved to the desk, examining the open book before the corpse. His eyes narrowed. Then he bent to the floor, his fingers grazing something unseen. He exhaled slowly. "Ah, what is it?" I asked. He rose, his expression unreadable. "An answer," he murmured, "though not one we shall speak of just yet." I frowned. "You already know how this was done?" Holmes turned to the body once more. His voice was quiet but absolute. "This is no curse, Watson. This is a design." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of Holmes's words settled over us like the dust in the air, heavy and unshaken. Lord Edwin's lips parted, his breath shallow. "You mean this was planned?" Holmes straightened, brushing off his coat. "Planned, executed, and designed with impeccable precision." His gaze moved over the room once more. "We are dealing with an intellect that does not merely rely on violence, Lord Ashwick. We are dealing with an architect of deception." I swallowed. "But the locked door—" "An illusion," Holmes cut in. "A trick as old as time. It was never a question of how the killer entered the room, Watson. It was a question of whether he ever left it at all." A chill ran down my spine. Holmes's meaning was clear. The killer was still inside the house. Holmes turned to Lord Edwin. "The pattern is repeating itself, my lord. But this time, we shall ensure that it is broken." I exhaled slowly, glancing once more at the lifeless form of Richard Ashwick. There were secrets within these walls, buried deep, and tonight, Holmes would unearth them all. Chapter 2. The Ghosts of the Past. The morning light filtered weakly through the thick velvet curtains of Ashwick Manor, doing little to dispel the air of unease that clung to the house. The air was damp, heavy with the remnants of the previous night's storm, and the corridors stretched ahead like darkened veins in the heart of some sleeping beast. Holmes moved with the assured precision of a man cataloguing his surroundings, his sharp gaze flickering over the architecture, the worn carpet, the faded tapestries that lined the walls. Watson, on the other hand, could not shake the sensation that the house was watching them in return. "It is remarkable," Holmes murmured, his voice breaking the silence, "how a house steeped in tragedy takes on a life of its own. Fear lingers in the walls, Watson, and where fear lingers, deception festers." The great clock in the main hall chimed 8. The sound was deep, resonant, yet it felt intrusive in the hush of the manor. Somewhere in the upper floor a door creaked. Lord Edwin approached them, his face drawn. "The house has been silent all night," he whispered. "No one has entered or left." Holmes tilted his head. "Then let us disturb the silence, my lord. There is a ghost that must be unmasked, and I do not believe in ghosts." The study was as they had left it the night before. Richard Ashwick's lifeless body remained slumped over his desk, the unnatural stillness of death stiffening his form. The bruising around his throat was dark now, more pronounced in the morning light, the mark of a strangler's grip. Holmes did not approach the body immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the mantel clock. "Tell me, Lord Edwin," he said, "at what time was Richard last seen alive?" Lord Edwin hesitated. He retired to his study shortly before 11. He was seen by my butler, Mr. Graves, at precisely 11:50. The scream, he swallowed, came just before midnight. Holmes turned, his eyes narrowing. And at 11:50, he was alone? Yes, the study door was locked. Holmes made a sound of acknowledgement and moved to the desk, examining the open book beneath Richard's hand. His fingers ghosted over the pages, his brows drawing together. A man sits alone in a locked room, entirely at ease. Yet within 10 minutes, he is dead, Holmes murmured. The question, Watson, is not how the killer entered, but whether the victim truly was alone at all. Watson stepped forward, the unnatural nature of the crime weighing on him. He tested the doorknob, already knowing what he would find. It turned easily now, but the lock had been engaged when they arrived. Holmes moved methodically. The windows remained bolted from within, the glass unmarred by any attempt at entry. The fireplace was too narrow for passage, and the bookshelves, though imposing, were solid oak with no gaps to conceal a hidden door. "It is impossible," Lord Edwin murmured. "No one could have entered, and yet—" He gestured toward Richard's still form. Holmes, crouched beside the body, inhaled sharply. "Not impossible," he corrected. "Ingenious." Watson frowned. "You have found something?" Holmes lifted his hand, displaying a small, nearly invisible indentation on the carpet near the desk. "A mark, Watson, left by someone who stood here not long ago." Lord Edwin's voice wavered. But the door was locked." Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the farthest corner of the room, kneeling once more. When he rose, there was a flicker of something triumphant in his gaze. "The room was sealed, yes, but I assure you, my lord, the killer was never truly gone." A faint scent lingered in the air, one that had gone unnoticed in the shock of the previous night. It was subtle, almost delicate, yet unmistakable. Holmes inhaled deeply, his expression sharpening. "Do you smell it, Watson?" Watson frowned. "Lavender." "Precisely. And yet, why should the scent of lavender persist so strongly in a room where no flowers have been placed?" Lord Edwin stiffened. That scent has been present at every death in this house." Holmes turned abruptly. "Every death!" Lord Edwin nodded. "It has always been the same. My grandfather's body was discovered in a locked room just like this one, and the air was thick with lavender. The same was recorded in 1825. And now—" He gestured toward Richard's form. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Fascinating." He turned back toward the body, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk, as though seeing something the rest of them could not. "Lavender is not the scent of death," he murmured. "It is the scent of misdirection." And with that, Sherlock Holmes stood, his face set in determination. "Watson, I do believe the game is afoot." The housemaid, a frail woman named Agnes, wrung her hands as she spoke. Her voice trembled, her eyes darting to the windows, as though expecting some unseen horror to return. "I saw him, sir," she whispered, "outside the study window, a figure, just standing there, watching." Holmes regarded her with keen intensity. "Describe him." Agnes hesitated. "He was tall, wrapped in a dark coat. The mist made him seem almost—" Her voice faltered. "Almost not of this world." Watson shifted uneasily. "And yet, there were no footprints." She shook her head violently. "None, sir! That's the truth of it. I ran outside myself to see, but the ground was untouched. No sign that any living soul had stood there." Holmes was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Miss Agnes. You may go." As the maid hurried away, Watson turned to Holmes. "You do not believe she imagined it?" Holmes's lips curled slightly. "On the contrary, Watson, I believe she saw precisely what she was meant to see." He turned toward the study, his sharp gaze sweeping the damp ground beyond the window. "And that, my friend, is far more interesting than if she had seen nothing at all." The butler, Mr. Graves, stood stiffly before them. his weathered face betraying no emotion. He was a man of careful words and measured steps, one who had spent a lifetime in the service of the Ashwick family. "It was shortly before midnight," he said, his voice steady. "I was making my final rounds when I heard it." "Heard what?" Holmes prompted. Mr. Graves's gaze darkened. "A voice, sir, just beyond the study door." Watson frowned. "Richard's voice?" "No, sir. It was too low. A murmur, barely more than a breath. But it carried a weight to it, a menace." Holmes studied the butler carefully. "And you are certain that the voice did not belong to Lord Edwin, or any other member of the household?" "Certain," Mr. Graves replied without hesitation. "It was someone else. Someone who should not have been there." Watson exhaled. "A ghostly figure in the mist, a whisper outside a locked room. Holmes, do you not find this unnerving?" Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "I find it illuminating," he said quietly. "And if I am correct, Watson, we shall soon find that the dead are not the only ones keeping secrets in this house." Holmes moved through the study with calculated precision, his fingers grazing the surface of the desk, the shelves, the book spines. He paused before an old leather-bound journal resting on the desk, directly beneath Richard's lifeless hand. "A man does not die with a book so conveniently placed unless he intended for someone to read it," Holmes murmured. He lifted the journal and attempted to open it. The clasp held fast, locked. "A locked journal," Watson said, stepping closer. "But where is the key?" Holmes turned the book over, examining its worn leather binding. "Not here," he murmured, and yet Richard had it in his possession before his death. Lord Edwin, standing a few paces away, spoke hesitantly. Richard had been troubled these past weeks. He mentioned discoveries. He spoke in riddles, as though he were afraid to say too much. Holmes' fingers tapped lightly against the cover of the journal. "A man who fears his words will outlive him, takes precautions," he mused. "This book may hold the truth behind his death." Watson exhaled. "And until we find the key, that truth remains buried." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we shall dig, Watson. We shall dig." Holmes lowered himself to the floor, his keen gaze sweeping the carpet with near reverence. Watson watched as his fingers traced an imperceptible indentation near the base of the desk. "Curious," Holmes murmured. Watson knelt beside him. "You found something?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pressed down lightly on the indentation. The floorboard shifted, just barely, but enough. "There," he said, his voice almost triumphant. "A hidden compartment, a panel beneath the desk, no doubt containing something Richard wished to keep from prying eyes." Lord Edwin stepped forward. "Then we must open it at once." Holmes raised a hand. "Patience, my lord. A lock exists not only to keep secrets in, but to keep intruders out. If Richard was killed for what he knew, I suspect his killer was searching for something." He glanced toward the locked journal still resting on the desk. Perhaps something he never found. Watson exhaled. "And if we find it?" Holmes straightened, dusting off his hands. His sharp eyes flickered toward the darkened corridor beyond. "Then, my dear Watson, we may find that we are no longer the only ones playing this game." His voice was measured, quiet, but it carried a weight that sent a chill up Watson's spine. The game, indeed, had only begun. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Key. Holmes stood in the dimly lit study, his gaze fixed upon the grand antique clock that stood against the far wall. It was an imposing thing, its polished wood dulled by age, its brass pendulum swaying with rhythmic precision. Without a word, he stepped forward, his fingers tracing the ornate carvings along its base. "Watson," he murmured, "do you recall what I said about men who know they are in danger?" Watson frowned. "That they take precautions." Holmes nodded. Richard Ashwick suspected he would not live long enough to reveal his discovery, and so he left it for us to find. His fingers pressed against the carved moulding just beneath the clock face. There was a faint click, A hidden compartment slid open. Nestled within, almost unremarkable in its simplicity, lay a small brass key. Lord Edwin paled. A key? Holmes held it up to the candlelight. Not just any key, my lord. The key, Watson exhaled. The key to Richard's locked journal. Holmes's lips curved slightly. Precisely. And now, gentlemen, let us see what Richard Ashwick feared enough to hide. Holmes turned the small brass key within the journal's lock. The clasp clicked open, the old leather creaking as he carefully turned the first page. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as though written by a man whose mind had been racing far ahead of his pen. Watson leaned closer, reading over Holmes's shoulder. I have uncovered something terrible. The deaths, every 50 years, are not random. They are chosen. Lord Edwin sucked in a breath. Chosen? Holmes continued reading. I met with someone tonight. She knows the truth, though she fears speaking it aloud. She has agreed to meet again tomorrow. I must tread carefully. If what she says is true, then this house is not cursed. It is controlled. Watson glanced at Holmes. Someone knew what was happening. Who was he meeting? Holmes turned the page, his keen eyes narrowing at the next name scrawled across the parchment. Evelyn Marchant. There was a heavy silence. Holmes shut the journal with a deliberate snap. We leave for the village, he announced. Miss Marchant may not have much time. The village inn was a modest structure, its windows glowing warmly against the cold night air. Holmes and Watson stepped inside, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. A woman sat alone at a corner table, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. Her dark eyes flicked up as they approached, filled with something that Watson immediately recognized as fear. Miss Marchant, Holmes said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. We know that you met with Richard Ashwick before his death, Holmes continued. We need to know what you told him. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she set down her cup. It is not safe to speak of such things. Watson leaned forward. Miss Marchant, Richard Ashwick was murdered. If you know something... She swallowed hard. He came to me because he suspected the truth. The deaths in Ashwick Manor, they are no coincidence. They happen because they must happen. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Because someone ensures they do. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting a shadow to emerge from the darkness beyond. And then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, It is already too late. The scream cut through the night like the wail of a dying animal. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, Watson close behind. The innkeeper, pale with fright, gestured frantically toward the stairs. The lady! Miss Marchant! Holmes took the steps 2 at a time, bursting into the dimly lit hallway. The door to Evelyn's room was ajar. Inside, the curtains billowed from the open window, the cold wind whipping through the chamber. Watson stepped forward and froze. Evelyn Marchant lay sprawled upon the wooden floor, her lifeless eyes fixed on the ceiling, her lips parted as though she had tried to scream. A dark bruise wrapped around her throat, the unmistakable mark of strangulation. Holmes stood motionless, his keen gaze sweeping the room. They were fast, he murmured. Efficient. His fingers traced the edge of the open window frame. They left no trace of themselves, only their work. Watson swallowed hard. Holmes. She knew too much. Holmes's jaw tightened. Indeed. He turned, his voice low and dangerous. And now, Watson, so do we. Holmes sat in quiet contemplation, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The journal lay open before him, its ink-stained pages whispering secrets of a conspiracy long hidden beneath the guise of superstition. This is no ghost story, he murmured. This is a mechanism, a system. Watson frowned. What do you mean? Holmes tapped a section of Richard Ashwick's frantic writing. Every 50 years an Ashwick dies, always in a locked room, always without explanation. It has been called a curse. But what is a curse if not an excuse to prevent inquiry? What if it is not fate that decides, but rather a hand that guides? Lord Edwin paled. You believe these deaths are orchestrated? Holmes's voice was sharp. Not only orchestrated, my lord, but essential. Someone has ensured that each heir to this estate perishes at the appointed time. He exhaled. The question remains, why? Before Watson could respond, a sudden crash rang through the manor. Then, the unmistakable scent of smoke filled the air. Holmes rose abruptly. Watson, Richard's study. By the time they reached the study, the flames had begun their insidious work, licking hungrily at the edges of the bookshelves. The fire had been set deliberately, a trail of embers leading from the desk where Richard's journal had lain moments before. Holmes wasted no time. He seized a heavy rug and flung it over the flames, smothering the fire before it could consume more than a few volumes. Watson and Lord Edwin worked quickly, throwing pitchers of water onto the embers. The air was thick with the acrid scent of charred parchment. Holmes straightened, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. They are growing desperate, he murmured. Someone wished to destroy evidence. He stopped abruptly. His eyes locked onto a small, half-burned scrap of paper near the fireplace. He bent and retrieved it, his expression unreadable as he turned it over. The edges were blackened, but the ink remained. One word was still legible. Inheritance. Holmes exhaled slowly. So that is the game they play. But before he could say more, a sharp noise echoed from the grand staircase. A shuffle, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps rushing toward them. Then a cry, followed by a sudden, sickening thud. Watson was the first to reach the landing. His breath caught in his throat. Holmes lay sprawled at the base of the staircase, motionless. Holmes! Watson rushed forward, falling to his knees beside his friend. Speak to me! A groan, quiet but alive. Holmes's hand twitched, and his sharp grey eyes flickered open. Watson, he murmured, forgive me, but I shall require your assistance in standing. Relief flooded Watson as he helped Holmes to his feet. His coat was dusted with soot, and a bruise had already begun to form on his temple, but he was, remarkably, unharmed. Lord Edwin descended the stairs, his face ghostly white. Someone tried to kill you. Holmes exhaled sharply, adjusting his collar. An unoriginal approach, but effective in its simplicity. I was struck from behind. He turned his gaze toward the shadows at the top of the staircase. And yet, our assailant has vanished. Watson's grip on his cane tightened. Holmes, this is no longer a matter of deduction. This is survival. Holmes gave him a tight-lipped smile. Then, Watson, let us ensure we live long enough to solve it. But just as he turned back toward the study, something caught his eye, something hidden within the desk that had survived the fire, a glint of brass. Holmes strode forward and pulled open the hidden compartment. Inside, a single object lay waiting, a second key, and this one was stained with blood. Holmes held up the second key, his fingers brushing over the dried crimson that marred its surface. The silence in the room deepened, as though the walls themselves had been stunned into stillness. Watson stared at it. Another key? But why? Holmes turned it over, his expression sharp with understanding. 2 identical keys, Watson, one hidden by Richard Ashwick before his death, the other left behind in an act of arrogance. This was meant to be found. Lord Edwin swallowed hard. What are you saying? Holmes exhaled slowly. Consider the implications. If Richard had one key, then someone else had the other. His gaze darkened. This second key belonged to the murderer. Watson paled. You mean the killer entered the study before Richard's death, but the room was locked from within? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Exactly. This was not a case of entry, but of exit. The killer was never locked out, Watson. He paused. He was locked in. The realization settled upon them like a thick fog. Somewhere within this house, the murderer still walked among them. And he knew they were closing in. Holmes stood in the center of the ruined study, the 2 keys gleaming in his hands. His mind worked rapidly, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for decades. 2 keys, 2 murders, 2 secrets, he murmured. Watson, we have been operating under the assumption that these deaths, separated by half a century, were part of the same pattern. Watson frowned. And they are not. Holmes's gaze flickered toward Lord Edwin. Not in the way we believed. This is not the work of a single killer, but a legacy. A crime passed from one hand to another, preserved through generations. Lord Edwin's voice wavered. You mean, my grandfather's death, my cousin's... It was all planned. Holmes nodded. Each time, the killer ensures their own survival, while eliminating the one who stands in their way. And then, 50 years later, the cycle repeats, because it must. Watson exhaled. But why? Holmes's grip on the keys tightened. Because of what Richard Ashwick discovered. Something worth killing for, something worth passing down from one murderer to the next. He turned toward the shadows beyond the study door. And now, my dear Watson, we must uncover what that secret is, before we become the next casualties in this deadly inheritance. Chapter 4. The Man in the Mirror. Holmes stood before the grand bookcase in Ashwick Manor's study, his fingers trailing over the aged spines of forgotten tomes. His gaze sharpened as he stopped at an unremarkable volume, one that, unlike the others, bore no dust upon its surface. With a calculated motion, he pulled the book free. A soft click echoed through the room. The bookcase groaned, shifting slightly, and then, ever so slowly, it swung outward, revealing a hidden compartment behind the woodwork. Lord Edwin's breath hitched. What is this? Holmes reached inside and withdrew a bundle of aged documents, bound together with a brittle ribbon. He unrolled the topmost parchment with care, his eyes scanning the words. A moment later, he let out a quiet breath. The last will and testament of Victor Ashwick, he murmured. Dated 1825. Watson stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. The script was ornate, the ink faded but legible. Yet it was the final clause that sent a chill through him. Should I perish by unnatural means, the Ashwick estate shall pass not to my direct heirs, but to my younger brother and his descendants. Holmes's lips curled. A will designed not to protect, but to invite murder. He turned to Lord Edwin, his voice edged with steel. And the pattern began. Watson watched as Holmes spread the documents across the desk, arranging them with meticulous precision. Names, dates, inheritances, all linked by an invisible thread. Do you see it now, Watson? Holmes murmured. This is no random series of misfortunes, no supernatural hand at work. It is a design. Watson exhaled. Each murder followed the same structure. An heir dies under impossible circumstances, and the fortune shifts down the bloodline. Holmes nodded. And always to the same branch of the family. His finger tapped against the final column of names. From Victor Ashwick's brother, to his son, to his grandson. And now, he lifted his gaze, his expression unreadable. Lord Edwin swallowed hard. You think his voice faltered, that I had something to do with Richard's death? Holmes held his stare. The past murders ensured that each generation of your line retained control over the Ashwick fortune. That is not a coincidence. Watson studied the nobleman's face, searching for cracks in his carefully composed features. There was fear there, yes. But was it the fear of a man haunted by his family's dark past? Or the fear of a man who had just been unmasked? Holmes turned away, his voice quiet, but firm. There is only one way to know for certain. The silence stretched long between them. Lord Edwin's hand tightened against the armrest of his chair. This is madness, he whispered. Holmes tilted his head. Is it? You are the only Ashwick remaining who stood to benefit from Richard's death. Watson saw the flicker of something dark pass through Lord Edwin's gaze. Holmes pressed on, his voice like a knife cutting through the tension. You inherited a legacy, my lord, one built not upon tradition, but upon murder. Each generation has followed the same pattern, eliminating their rivals before the appointed year could claim them. And now, in 1925, it was Richard's turn. Lord Edwin's lips parted, but no words came. You had the means, the opportunity, and the knowledge of the legend, Holmes continued. But most damning of all, you had the key. Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew the blood-stained key they had discovered. He held it up, letting the firelight dance upon its tarnished surface. This was not Richard's key, it was yours. The key that locked him inside his study, sealing his fate. Lord Edwin's breath came faster now, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. Watson watched him closely. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous. Holmes took a step forward, his voice calm, unwavering. Tell me, Lord Edwin, do you deny it? A heavy silence followed. Lord Edwin's fingers twitched. Then, as if some great tension within him had snapped, he exhaled shakily. You are mistaken, Mr. Holmes, he said softly. I would never… Holmes raised a hand, cutting him off. Do not trouble yourself with denial, my lord. It is not you whom I am addressing. Lord Edwin blinked. What? Holmes turned away, strolling toward the fireplace. A killer who has eliminated his rivals once will do so again. And so, what is the simplest way to expose him? Watson stiffened. Holmes continued, his voice deliberate. The simplest way, my dear Watson, is to give him reason to act again. He turned back to Lord Edwin, a faint smirk on his lips. Which is why I have informed the household that we shall be departing tomorrow, leaving the mystery unsolved. Watson inhaled sharply. You mean… Holmes nodded. The murderer will believe himself victorious. But tonight, my dear Watson, he shall make his final mistake. And as the grandfather clock struck the midnight hour, Holmes's gaze darkened. The trap is set. The house had fallen into an eerie silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the midnight hour, its hollow toll reverberating through the corridors. Holmes and Watson stood concealed in the shadows of the drawing room, their breaths slow and measured. Then came the sound they had been waiting for. The creak of a door opening, footsteps gliding across the wooden floor. Holmes motioned for Watson to remain still. From their vantage point, they could see Lord Edwin Ashwick moving cautiously toward the study, his every movement betraying the careful deliberation of a man who believed himself unwatched. With a practiced hand, Edwin produced a small key and slipped it into the study door's lock. He entered swiftly and, in the flickering glow of the fireplace, approached the grand mirror that hung opposite the desk. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the darkness. Watch closely, Watson, he whispered. Edwin reached behind the frame, pressing something unseen. The mirror gave a barely perceptible shudder. Then, soundlessly, it swung open like a door. A hidden passage. A direct, unseen route into the study. And with that, the mystery of the locked room murders was finally laid bare. Holmes stepped forward into the dimly lit study, his presence sudden and undeniable. A rather ingenious method, my lord, he said smoothly. A mirror concealing a passage, an old trick but effective. Lord Edwin spun around, his face paling in the firelight. Holmes raised a finger. Ah, no need for further pretense. We now understand how you entered and exited a locked room unseen, but there is one final detail that intrigued me. His sharp gaze drifted to the unlit corner of the study. The lavender, Watson. Watson inhaled deeply. The scent was faint, but unmistakable, just as it had been on the night of Richard Ashwick's murder. A curious thing, Holmes continued, how every supposed curse in this house carried with it the fragrance of lavender. One might assume it was coincidence, but I do not deal in such things. He turned back to Edwin. It was a deception, was it not? A perfume-soaked cloth left behind at each crime scene, reinforcing the illusion of something unnatural. Fear, after all, is the greatest weapon of all. Edwin's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Holmes exhaled. It was a clever trick, my lord, but as all tricks do, it has come to an end. Holmes crossed the room, retrieved the journal from the desk, and opened it to the final pages. This, he said, was your greatest miscalculation. He turned to Watson. Do you recall what we found in Richard's locked journal? Watson nodded. His discovery, that the deaths in this house were not supernatural, but deliberate, that someone was ensuring the pattern continued. Holmes gestured toward Edwin. He knew, and so he had to die. He flipped the journal open to a damning entry. I have seen him. I know the truth. The mirror hides more than a reflection. It hides a passage. If I am found dead, it was no curse, but murder. And the murderer's name is... Holmes let the silence stretch. The ink stops there, he murmured. But it does not need to continue. We know the name, do we not? Edwin's breath was ragged now. The polished mask he had worn since their arrival was beginning to crack. Holmes closed the journal with a soft snap. You have played your part well, Lord Ashwick, but I am afraid the final act belongs to me. Edwin's body tensed, the gleam of sweat forming along his brow. You think you have won, he said through gritted teeth. Holmes tilted his head. Oh, I do not think, my lord. I know. The flickering fire cast shifting shadows along the walls as Edwin took a slow step backward, his hand moving imperceptibly toward the desk. Holmes's sharp eyes caught the movement, but he did not react. Not yet. You are cornered, Watson said. Surrender now, and at least spare yourself the disgrace of being dragged from your home in shackles. But Edwin's gaze had hardened, his mind calculating his final desperate move. His fingers brushed against the polished wood of the desk, reaching. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Don't. Too late. Edwin lunged, his hand closing around the cold steel of a hidden pistol. He turned, the barrel lifting. A sharp click. Don't move! The voice was Watson's, steady and unwavering. His revolver was raised, aimed directly at Edwin's chest. For a moment no one breathed. Then Holmes exhaled softly. Checkmate, my lord. Edwin's shoulders sagged. The fight had left him. The man who had orchestrated generations of death had at last met his own inevitable fate. The Ashwick murders were over. Chapter 5. The Haunting Aftermath. Lord Edwin Ashwick sat motionless in the great hall, his wrists bound in iron, his once composed demeanour shattered. The flickering candlelight cast long, jagged shadows across the cold stone walls, as if the manor itself recoiled from its master. Inspector Harrington, a stout man with a severe expression, snapped his notebook shut. We have all we need, Mr. Holmes. Lord Edwin will be taken into custody at once. Holmes, standing by the fireplace, merely nodded. His gaze was fixed on the dying embers, his sharp mind already shifting beyond the case, as though solving it had merely been a necessary inconvenience. Watson, however, could not look away from Edwin. There was something in the man's eyes, not mere defeat, but something deeper, a silence too heavy for words. As the inspector led Edwin toward the great doors, the nobleman paused, glancing over his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow. You think you have ended it, he said, but some things do not end. Some things remain. Holmes did not flinch. Superstition is a refuge for those who fear reason, Lord Ashwick, and reason has prevailed. Edwin's lips parted as if to respond, but then, without another word, he was led away, his footfalls vanishing into the night. The Ashwick curse was dead, or so they thought. The great doors slammed shut behind Edwin's departing figure, leaving only a hush in his absence. Yet that hush was not relief. It was something heavier, more uncertain. The remaining members of the Ashwick household stood in uneasy silence. The servants, the distant relatives, even the butler, Mr. Graves, each wore the expression of a person who had escaped one horror, only to find themselves standing in the shadow of another. Watson studied their faces. Some bore quiet relief, others only dread. It was as if, despite the truth being uncovered, the weight of the past still clung to them. Even with Edwin gone, they fear, Watson murmured, as though the house itself will not let them go. Holmes turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled figures. Fear lingers where it is given permission to do so, he said. They have lived under the shadow of an illusion for generations. Even in the face of reason, some will never let it go. A sudden gust of wind rattled the high windows. A few of the household members shivered, exchanging nervous glances. Watson exhaled. Perhaps it will take time. Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. Time, my dear Watson, does not heal all ghosts. The storm had passed, and the night lay still over Ashwick Manor. The great house, now emptied of its master, seemed strangely hollow, its corridors stretching into darkness, untouched by time. Watson stood in the entrance hall, fastening his coat, preparing for their departure. Holmes, as ever, was lost in thought, his keen mind already moving beyond Ashwick to whatever mystery would next demand his attention. But then, a flicker of movement. Watson turned sharply, his gaze drawn to the study. The door, which had been left ajar, now stood slightly more open, as though disturbed by some unseen hand. His breath caught. Within the dimly lit room, past the grand desk and towering bookshelves, a shadow moved. Holmes. His voice was hushed, urgent. Holmes, adjusting his gloves, barely looked up. In the study. Watson swallowed. I saw... He hesitated. A trick of the candlelight? A shift of the curtains? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Surely you do not mean to suggest the house itself is unwilling to let us leave? Watson exhaled, shaking his head. No, of course not. And yet, as they turned away, leaving the study behind, the door creaked, ever so slightly. The night air was crisp as they stepped onto the grounds of Ashwick Manor. Their carriage awaited, the horses restless in the quiet. Watson exhaled, forcing the tension from his shoulders. Holmes, beside him, remained composed, his mind still dancing through the echoes of the case. Then, a sound, a single footstep, software deliberate, from inside the house. Watson turned sharply, his heart hammering. Holmes! Holmes, ever the skeptic, remained still. The staff, no doubt. Watson's grip on his cane tightened. We were the last to leave. A pause. Then, another step. Closer now. Measured. Almost expectant. Holmes finally turned, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply listened. The wind whispered through the trees. The great house loomed behind them, dark and silent. And yet, something watched. Watson exhaled. Tell me, Holmes, do you believe in ghosts? Holmes's gaze lingered on the manor's towering frame. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. I believe in deception, Watson. A pause, then softer. But some questions are best left unanswered. The wind howled through the empty halls as they departed. And somewhere, in the depths of Ashwick Manor, something unseen remained. Waiting. Holmes moved swiftly, his fingers tightening around the doorknob of the study. Without hesitation, he forced it open. The heavy oak groaned on its hinges, revealing nothing. The room lay undisturbed. The desk, the bookshelves, the great mirror, all sat in quiet stillness, bathed in the pale glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. No movement, no sign of intrusion. Yet Watson felt it. A presence, lingering just beyond reach, watching. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over the space. His keen eyes missed nothing: the settled dust on the carpet, the untouched quills on the desk, the reflection of the empty room in the great mirror. There was someone here, Watson murmured, his voice low. I saw the door shift. Holmes did not answer immediately. He inhaled slowly, his brow furrowing. Then, ever so faintly, it reached them. The scent of lavender. Holmes exhaled. Curious, he murmured. Watson swallowed hard. Holmes, what are you thinking? But Holmes merely turned away, adjusting his coat. Come, Watson. It is time we took our leave. Watson hesitated. There were no footprints, no sign of entry or exit. And yet, he knew beyond reason that something had been there. And perhaps still was. The night air was crisp as they stepped out onto the gravel path, their footsteps muffled against the cold earth. The carriage awaited them beyond the wrought iron gates, but Watson found himself pausing, his gaze drawn back to the manor. It loomed in the darkness, its once grand windows now vacant, hollow. The house felt different now, emptier, yes, but also aware. Holmes adjusted his gloves, but even he, for once, did not move immediately. He stood beside Watson, his sharp eyes fixed upon the towering estate. They will tear it down eventually, Watson murmured, or abandon it altogether. Holmes gave a quiet hum. Perhaps. His gaze flickered toward the upper windows, toward the study where, moments ago, they had stood. And yet, something tells me this house will remain standing for quite some time. A gust of wind swept through the trees, rattling the iron gates. The house remained motionless, its great shadow stretching over the grounds. Then, just for a moment, Watson thought he saw it, a flicker of movement, a shape in the window. But when he blinked, it was gone. Holmes turned. Come, Watson, London awaits. And with that, they left Ashwick Manor behind, or so they believed. The train rocked gently as it cut through the mist-covered countryside, its rhythmic churning a steady contrast to the storm of thoughts in Watson's mind. He sat across from Holmes, who had not spoken in some time. His companion was staring out at the darkened landscape, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. Watson sighed, settling back into his seat. For a long while, he merely listened to the hum of the train, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind against the windows. Then, at last, he spoke. Holmes, do you believe in ghosts? Holmes did not immediately respond. His grey eyes remained fixed on the passing fields, his thoughts seemingly far beyond the present. Watson exhaled. Because I must tell you, I saw something, back in that house, more than once. A movement, a presence. I know logic tells me otherwise, but... He hesitated. But tell me, Holmes, what do you truly believe? Holmes finally turned to face him, his expression as enigmatic as ever. You seek certainty, Watson, but certainty is a rare luxury in our line of work. Watson frowned. That is not an answer. Holmes studied him for a moment longer. Then at last he spoke. There are explanations for everything, he murmured. But not all explanations bring comfort. And with that, he turned back to the window, his reflection merging with the fog beyond. The train rattled on, carrying them ever closer to London. But Watson's mind remained behind, trapped within the halls of Ashwick Manor, searching for answers he was no longer certain he wanted to find. He leaned forward. Holmes, I know you. You saw something too. You sensed it. Holmes did not look at him. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his breath faint against the window pane. I sense deception, he said at last. That much is undeniable. Watson shook his head. That is not what I mean, and you know it. Holmes was silent for a long moment. The rhythmic churning of the train filled the space between them, a quiet metronome to his thoughts. Then finally, he spoke. Some questions, Watson, are best left unanswered. Watson felt a chill settle over him, not at the words themselves, but at the way Holmes said them. Not as a dismissal, not as a deflection, but as a warning. Outside, the mist rolled across the hills, swallowing the landscape whole. The past had been left behind. The case had been solved. And yet, the scent of lavender still lingered in Watson's mind, as if something had followed them from Ashwick Manor, waiting, watching. The train pressed on, but some mysteries, it seemed, were never meant to be solved.